comes down to a fight between you and me, then you are doomed to lose. Keep the red flag flying here.
Hello and welcome to Socialist Think Tank. Welcome to Socialist Night Live, Refugee Crisis. We are here to talk about refugees from all different conflicts around the world. This is a serious issue, something that we should be talking about a lot more and making sure that people are given a safe space. And, you know, there's a lot of misunderstanding around this topic. So we're going to speak to some experts on this. Before we do that, though, you will notice in the corner of the screen, we are now proudly sporting a little thing that says Independent Media Awards 2022 Podcast or Live Stream of the Year. So whether you are listening to this after the event on a podcast, which many of you do, or if you are watching the live stream, both of those things, it's almost like this award was made for us, like podcast or live stream of the year, because we're both. So, yeah, we're really proud of that one. Thanks to the Independent Media Association for giving us this award. Really, really proud to be part of the Independent Media Association. Independent media is absolutely vital because, for one thing, people aren't talking about things like this. And they should be. So that's where we come in. We try to give a voice to the issues that will simply not be brought up in the mainstream media. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go around the panel. Firstly, on comments tonight, we've got Jane Strange. How are you doing, Jane?
Good, thank you. Very pleased to be here. Very pleased to see three brilliant guests. So looking forward to hear what they've got to say.
Brilliant. And thanks for all you do, and we'll be hearing from you later on. So if you've got any comments, as you can see, they do appear on the screen as we are going. So you are part of the show as well, and that's a really, really important part of this. Next, I'm going to ask for a little bit of a longer introduction. I'm going to go to Mike first. So Mike, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background before we go into the main part of the show.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here with you all this evening. So my name's Mike Tapp, and my background is in service, really. So I joined the military when I was about 20, served for 6 years. During that period, I deployed to Iraq once and Afghanistan twice. Working mainly in intelligence role, and a sort of large part of that in Afghanistan was sort of centered around negotiating sort of peaceful solutions with the enemy before troops went in to try and sort of reduce the risk of any loss of life. After the military, I joined the National Crime Agency, where I focused on serious organised crime groups. A lot of that was around human trafficking, but also the drugs crime, which is so rife. And then I spent some time at the Ministry of Defence working in a counter-terrorism role. That's me.
Wow, that's quite a story there. And it's funny that we've spoken about refugees and we've spoken about conflicts in the past. And we're on a show called Socialist Think Tank. You wouldn't think, I think the caricature would be that we wouldn't be interested in voices of people who've served in the military and things, but we've actually had a number of people on in the past who've shared their experiences from who've been involved in conflicts and stuff. So it just does go to show that the caricature that a lot of people would say about people who have served is not accurate
Mm. It's
necessarily.
funny.
So
So I'm a committed Labour member, and what's sort of drawn me to that is what I've been through and experienced and seen. So from the suffering and injustice, around the world, with the MOD, I travelled to North Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, etc., and seeing that goes hand in hand with what Labour are trying to achieve in general. With the crime, it's the failures of the Conservative government that unfortunately sets the conditions that unfortunately leads people to crime. The system that we've got in place at the moment is far too heavy on punishment and doesn't even touch on rehabilitation, despite saying it does. So that's what sort of really guided me in this direction. Things I've seen, I suppose.
absolutely fascinating. Okay, next I'm going to move on to Moses. Moses, I'm going to come to you next. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Oh, you just muted there, Moses.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm so happy to be on this evening. It's Moses Chikwekwete Mbano. Don't bite your tongue when you try to call Chikwekwete. And I come from Zimbabwe. I came here in this country 2002, the beginning. And I'm one of the refugee people as well, and I'm an asylum seeker. We ran away from persecution, my regime as well. Under Robert Mugabe, it has been very, very brutal, and it was not sparing anybody. So you have to dash, for your life. So I came over here hoping to be, given a good sanctuary. However, there are so many, things need to be sorted for us to be recognized. So I think I had to go into loads of organizations as well that actually is advocating about refugees. Soro, Status Now for All, Kill the Bill now. We've got so many coming up at the moment. So I'm so proud to be part of an active member in all these groups. So together, I think we can come up with a solution to make our governments understand our plight. Thank you.
Wow, again, an incredible story there as well. And what did you do in Zimbabwe before you left?
Our countries, as much as they are, it was really very difficult for you to engage into any things. There is something we call like nepotism, whereby if you don't know somebody, you can't be somebody. So if you are disadvantaged, that's it for you. They just want to make you do things. If you refuse, then you are done. You know what I mean? So that's the type of dirty governments that we grew up in. So really, I never did anything before I came here.
Right. Okay.
But you probably
I've
had
met...
aspirations, Moses.
Sorry?
You probably had aspirations and dreams. So.
Oh yes, that's why I came out. I said, let me just go. I know there are some hands with me, so that's why I ran away and they came over and get that him.
We just lost you a little bit there, but I think we got the general idea of what you were saying there. And one of the things I've met through my trade union work, I've met a couple of Zimbabwean teachers, and a lot of the time it's the teachers who are on, at the front line of the persecution because they run the elections, and they're seen as a threat to the government because they would run the elections fairly, and it's a terrible regime, and yeah, it must have been an absolutely terrifying experience for you. So we're so glad to have you on. And finally, last but certainly not least, we're going to go to a familiar face who's been on the show before, Julie Ward, someone who is a friend of the show, and you will have seen her name come up in the comments as well. So someone who is not only a honoured guest, but also one of our members and a fan. So how are you doing, Julie?
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, recovering from quite a lot of kind of real emotional roller coaster experiences that I've had recently. Yeah, you and many people know that I was in Ukraine just before the invasion. I've also been in Iraq recently on a mission to, on a study visit, to fact-finding visit, to try and gather evidence about chemical weapons attacks on Kurdish people. So yeah, and I've just been in the Netherlands doing election observation, Moses. So yeah, so I've been busy.
And your background, obviously, like you'd been an MEP until relatively recently, and one of the things I massively admire about you is, you know, you probably could have taken a back seat and said, "I've done that. That's that part of my life over with." But you've thrown yourself into the into fighting for justice wherever you go, and that is something obviously like we need. And it's a huge, when you see other people disappearing off into the gambling industry, for example, and getting like these top jobs with the gambling industry and gambling lobby and stuff, and instead you're doing these things. So solidarity to you. It's been absolutely inspirational.
Yeah, thanks. Well, my background is really working in civil society, working in the voluntary sector, and working as being a campaigner. And even when I was elected, I couldn't kind of stop that. I was totally, I was still very focused on a lot of the kind of extra work that I could do as an MEP. So yes, I was on the Committee for Culture and Education and Women's Rights and Gender Equality, but I did masses and masses of human rights work because I couldn't bear to turn my back on people, really. And I recognized in myself that kind of desire, really, for justice. And I often put myself in other people's shoes, and that might be because I was a drama practitioner. I worked in the arts before I worked in politics. And in theatre, you really have to stand in other people's shoes. You have to learn what it's like to be other people in order to be a credible performer or a credible dramatist. And so I always found it really impossible to say no to the many people who came to my office begging me to do very simple things like, make a 1-minute speech in the plenary about a human rights issue. These weren't like big asks in a way. Write letters to presidents, prime ministers, ambassadors, so that people could have prison visits or could receive medical attention. I couldn't not do it. And I suppose since because I stayed right to the end of my mandate, so I was there until Brexit Day, and then subsequent to that, I've come back home to County Durham, and found so many things that we need to mobilize together. We need to do so many things working together to try and challenge what this government is doing and stand up for fairness and and be compassionate. So yeah, I'm not really up for a quiet life at the minute.
As I say, solidarity to you, and thank you for all you do. Okay, so what we're going to do is now we're going to move into the crisis section of this. So what is a refugee crisis? Like, so we've heard a lot more in the media about it lately. We've had Grant Shapps, even like this right-wing Tory, suggesting that he would take a Ukrainian family into his home. I suppose, like, I'd like everyone to address this at some point. Like, is this political posturing? Are people trying to take advantage of this? And why is it that, all of a sudden there are conflicts around the world? We clearly care about the Ukrainian people. Absolutely, undoubtedly. Let's put like that. There is no doubt about that we really care about these people who have been displaced. But I think it's a genuine concern to think, why haven't other conflicts been as high profile? and why has there been such a negative idea around that. But I'm going to let you go with anything on this one, because I know you've got your own special areas of expertise. So I'm going to go to Mike first and just say, what's the refugee crisis? Why do we have one? And where do you fit in with that?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, this isn't new, and it's global, and it's been going on for decades. I think when it comes to Ukraine, which is all over the news, and we've had an outpouring of emotion from Europe and from the UK. I think a part of that is because with Ukraine being Western and European, people look at them and they see themselves, and unfortunately, when things are happening in Africa and Middle East, people find it more difficult to relate, and that's wrong, obviously. But I think there is that psychology to it. Our government response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis has been absolutely disgraceful and embarrassing, and I think you're getting even sort of large swathes of conservative voters also embarrassed by this. And from my point of view, when I see Priti Patel and Elthit talking about security concerns of those needing to come over, it just fills me with frustration and anger, because I mean, the risk from the GRU, which is the sort of military intelligence wing from Russia, is minimal in terms of them sneaking in as refugees. We've seen in Salisbury and other incidents that they come over on false passports. They simply don't need to use that sort of complex way of accessing the country. And then when it comes to the threat from sort of known criminals, well, we'll do what all the other EU nations are doing and carry out retrospective checks. And if there are known criminals, then we deport them. But really, it's a minimal risk when you're looking at the gains that those would take from coming into the United Kingdom as asylum seekers, essentially. And I spoke to a guy from my town a couple of weeks ago, and his mum was Ukrainian. He's a Ukrainian British citizen. He'd gone out and rescued her from Ukraine, and he's stuck in Poland. Because the Home Office system is so callous and incompetent both at the same time, that they've had to put biometrics in. It says 24 hours from the visa application system, waiting 2 weeks. The MP here is looking at it, but his hands are, he's a conservative, but his hands are tied by the callous system that's introduced by Priti Patel. So, it's embarrassing, it's disgraceful, and it's the rhetoric is just filled with lies, unfortunately.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't even know that they were saying that there was a risk of bringing in refugees. I didn't really realize. I've heard that in other things, because we've always heard that as it's almost a trope, isn't it? It's like, oh, well, if you let them in, then you're just letting in a lot of terrorists. And I've heard people saying that about, like, that's the difference lately, because in Syria, if you're inviting them in, there's a big risk of them being terrorists, which is nonsense again. Or maybe it isn't.
Spies and criminals for this lot, unfortunately. Yeah. It just shows how absurd it is, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Julie, would you like to come in on that?
Well, I have never believed that there is a refugee crisis in Europe, I have to say. There is a refugee crisis in Lebanon. There's a refugee crisis in many other places around the world. Refugee, sadly, waves of refugees have been part of our society, part of our culture for generations, for centuries. So I'm descended from Huguenot refugees. Okay? So these were people from northern France who fled religious persecution and found a welcome, found a home here in the UK. My ancestors were lace makers, and they ended up living and making a home for themselves in Nottingham. And those of you who know Nottingham will know that there is a lace market there. And the refugees who settled in Nottingham founded the wealth of that city. And that is a really important story to tell. They brought with them extraordinary crafts and skills. They brought with them entrepreneurialism. They established themselves in a new country and contributed to that. So I think we have to start talking about refugees in a completely different way, because we don't need to look very far back into our own histories to realize that we're probably all from somewhere else. When I was campaigning to win my first election, the Syrian war had been happening, I think, for 2 years. So to win the European elections, we campaigned for a whole year. And I remember the summer of 2013, I was a volunteer for Oxfam on the Love Syria campaign. And what that essentially meant was going to music festivals to talk to people, not to ask them for money, but to talk to them, because the Syrian war had already disappeared from the front pages of the newspaper. And lots of people had forgotten about it, or they'd got all kinds of misinformation about it. And the idea that Oxfam had is that we need to have conversations to start talking to people about what it means to be a refugee, and in fact, Syria was a very advanced society. There were lots of the refugees who came from Syria were professional people, they were business people, they were teachers, academics, they were engineers. And this idea about what is a refugee, is often a very kind of narrow definition in people's heads, but actually it could be us, it could be all of us. Then last summer we had the horrendous failure of the West to deal with Afghanistan. So we've had all kinds of people, desperate to leave Afghanistan because their lives were clearly going to be under threat if they remained in the country. And in each of those situations, with the Syrian refugees and with the Afghan refugees, our country has absolutely failed. We only allowed a very small number of Syrian refugees to come here. Lord Alf Dubs has tried really hard to get the government to understand that at least they should show some compassion to unaccompanied minors, to child refugees who would be traveling, by themselves, completely alone, at risk of trafficking and abuse and all kinds of things. And even when the government were pushed really hard and begrudgingly decided to accept, I think it was about 500 children, they ditched the project after a couple of hundred and just didn't pursue it anymore. So I think we've, as a country, had a shameful response, actually, to welcoming people. And I don't see that this, I don't believe that we're showing any leadership whatsoever now with the Ukrainian crisis either, because what we've done, Priti Patel has continued the hostile environment that was begun by Theresa May. So the government have painted themselves into a corner, haven't they? They've done this whole thing about, well, we've got to have strong borders, and we've got to check everybody who's coming in. We've got to assume that they're going to be terrorists rather than assume that they might be, people who are clearly in need of sanctuary. And I think that's why all this horrendous bureaucracy exists. And it's been really painful to watch people on that border who are mostly women with children and with elderly parents trying to fill in multiple forms in a language that isn't their first language, often having to find translators, having fled without documents. I mean, you know, you don't necessarily leave a burning city or a bombed neighborhood having got all your documents. You might not even have passports. And so for people to find themselves in this situation at those borders, you know, having also said goodbye to their menfolk who have stayed to fight, I'm, you know, like Mike, I'm truly ashamed to be British, actually, when you see what's happening. Luckily, the British people have been much more genuinely compassionate, I think. And I'm really glad about that. And I think regarding the situation of refugees from other countries, so Black and brown refugees from Africa and the Middle East, for example, who have not been so welcome here, you know, all the people trying to cross the channel, the horrendous deaths that we've had there. There is a kind of racialized issue here. And what I think we need to do is to use the Ukrainian situation to teach people about the broader issues of what it means to be a refugee. Yes, we need to welcome the Ukrainian refugees, and we need to demonstrate that actually there are many other people fleeing conflict and unsustainable lives. And I'll talk about this a little bit more if you like, but I think that climate change and climate refugees is a thing, and people are leaving their countries because of desertification, because the crops have failed, because they have no water. And we, again, are partly responsible for that. So the broader we can make this issue to demonstrate, you know, that people should be able to live in peace, live without fear, live with basic services. And if they can't do that, then we've got to step up to the plate. And frankly, we haven't.
Wow, there's so many directions I could have gone in there, and one of them, like one of the things that I really noticed there was when you mentioned Theresa May, and there was this like almost rehabilitation of it because she isn't Boris Johnson, and people are looking back to the halcyon days where Theresa May was being horrible to refugees, and or wasn't that so much better? And I hate the rehabilitation of her because she was an absolute terror. So you did mention as well that these people could be us. Well, one of us, like it is us. So Moses, you know, after everything both Mike and Julie have said there, is there anything you'd like to add from your own personal perspective then, and how has life been as a refugee over the years?
Yeah, I think it is a fact, really, you know, that there is a lot that need to be done for people to understand actually what a refugee needs and what a refugee is. I think it has been marred by that, you know, by the notion that, you know, refugees were only previously defined as Europeans. From Julie's, what Julie said, that, you know, they ran away from France, where there were religious persecution. That's where it was firstly made. But today, as a refugee myself, I think the most difficult thing is to express yourself when you're needing help. The people that listens to you is like they got loads of ways of understanding you, but negatives, they just want to look on the negative side of you rather than the positive side of you. So if someone from Ukraine, like the previous speaker said, your house has been bombed, you just stood up and begin running. You don't think or know where your passport or your ID is. But when you come to this country particularly, they want your ID. But you had no time to carry that. You cannot remember. Your life is paramount. You're trying to run away to save your life, not the papers or whatever cards that were given at some point. So we want the government to understand that, you know, as a refugee, the definition itself is somebody who ran away from persecution. and that person is now unwilling to go back simply because of fear. It could be religious, it could be social, it could be political opinions, but you don't want to go back there because your life is at stake. So what we want to do is to highlight to the government to say they need to understand, they need to show compassion to these people, to us. They really need to stand in solidarity with every person, every refugee that is coming into this country, fleeing, the dangers in their countries there. So, like I said, my regime, the Robert Mugabe regime, it disqualifies. That's why I describe it, disqualifies human rights. As long as you are not them, you don't have to exist. So we saw people being shot at, live bullets, just a peaceful demonstration. People are getting shot, people are getting killed. Now they got people that actually knows that, oh, these people, they come from this section. They will come and investigate. Who is this one? Who is this one? They've been shown, and the people begin to disappear during the nights. People go to sleep in the evening. Tomorrow morning, just no, there were people that came at night. They just take this person, shove bags on his head. They dumped in the car, they drove away. That person, you never see that person ever again. So those are the kind of experience that we're facing, that, okay, where am I standing? If I stand up for my right to say, guys, I'm feeling the pressure here. Why can't the government take this route so that it can accommodate every individual, every citizen? Then you are a threat to the government. So we ran away because our lives were at stake. But now Priti Patel is not accepting us as well. That's where we got a serious problem. She got a foreign background herself. She didn't come here simply because she wanted to come here, but she had to come here to seek asylum. Her parents or whoever first came here, they came to seek asylum, and they were granted that same asylum. But today it's herself that doesn't even want. It's like we are a burden or we are a problem. She even actually mentioned that we don't want to do this one because these people, we don't want many people here. But you also came. That is our problem. You know what I mean? So what we want to do is together, like the way we are doing, discussing issues like this, we find a solution for the government to actually come to terms and understand what a refugee means and what does a refugee want in life. Because we are bleeding, our hearts, we lost relatives. Like, let me take you back at some point. My brother got into a detention that was in the late 1970s. He was coming from school. He was the Smith regime by then, before the Mugabe regime. He was taken and put in a detention from school. He's a school child. And there, when he came, he said, we were put in a room. They were beaten every single day, right? There is someone who is employed only to beat people. They were beaten there. Then at some point, a corpse was put in their cell. And there will be about, in a small room like this one, there will be about 100 people inside. A corpse was dumped in there for a week. And the doors are locked there. Most of them, when they came out there, my brother came out with asthma. He was asthmatic because the body decomposed and they were just inhaling all them kind of things. He passed away, unfortunately. So those things, when we express it to other people, to say pressure, political pressure is one thing that nobody would want to be subjected to. Political is very rough. And people, it's like they don't think that another person next to them has the right to survive. So we want the government, we want Boris Johnson, he got all the capacity to actually understand. He need to welcome the Ukrainians the way they are and process them here. We still got a backlog of the Afghanistans. We saw them, people hanging on the plane's wings. It's saying it's better to die than to have my neck cut. Rather, I fall down from the skies and just plunge, you die once. There's no pain. You know what I mean? So we want the government to say, okay, did you see what people are actually trying to do? They are risking. People, we ran away from bombs, landmines. We dug every bullet to end up here. We want the British government to actually consider what a refugee is and try to give them the sanctuary that they are crying for. We're hoping for laws. We want to contribute for this society because we met up with the British society. They are so welcoming. They are so generous. They are down to earth. But the government is letting them down simply because it's not actually playing according to the Geneva Convention of Human Rights, and they are not doing according to the protocols that were set in 1967. So I don't know where our government is standing. So I stand together with Julie Ward, Mike Tapp. You said a lot of very, very positive things there. And I think as we move on with different organizations meeting together, I think the number 10 will actually understand where we're coming from and where we are heading to. We had a plan that was sent to Zimbabwe, I think 2 weeks ago. I came to fight, and we've been supporting most of the people that actually ended up not being deported. And I'm talking about the government that says the country is poor, and they hire a double-decker plane that got a capacity of 500, only to send 5 people. So we ask now, people are struggling in the houses here, bills are rocketing, everything, petrols are rocketing, but you are sending a 500-seater plane with only 5 people. What are you benefiting out of that? Why couldn't they just allow these people to contribute to the economy of the country? We work, we contribute. We're not here to try to steal. We're not here to try to murder people. We just want to, blend and do something that is very positive to the country and contribute to Her Majesty.
Do you know, one of the problems I think we have, Moses, is that I think the Conservatives do understand this. I don't think they're stupid in that sense. I think they get it. I just think, unfortunately, they use division, cynicism, and fear as their political football to stay in power. Which makes it, I think, even worse, because lobbying to try and help them understand, unfortunately, I don't think has the impact that we'd like it to have, which is why it's so important that we get the Tories out at the next general election. I really strongly believe that the Labour government just simply would not be as callous and hostile. And it's something that I feel quite strongly about, is a way that we could potentially do this is turn some of the Tory rhetoric back on them. And I believe strongly that this hostile environment is bad for our national security. And I'll quickly touch on why. I won't go into too much detail because we'll be here all night. But firstly, you've got to look at the pushback policy that Priti Patel is pushing, something that's embarrassing for her and embarrassing for the Navy as well, because they don't want to be doing that. And actually, I don't think they will. But you kill an innocent person trying to come over, which is what that will lead to. And that is one surefire way of creating enemies. I've worked in counterterrorism, and I don't want to simplify how someone gets to that point of extremism. But an element of it is the way that you've been treated, and foreign policy comes into that, but so does an immigration system. And if you kill people trying to come over, then you're going to create enemies. So it's as simple as that. That is bad for national security. Not having safe routes, proper safe routes, obviously some are catered for, but in general they're not, which is why they're having to risk their lives to come over. Sort of promotes this Hunger Games attitude towards our immigration system. If you can get here, then we might let you into our asylum process, and that's before the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is going to actually make it a criminal offence. So when these poor, desperate people who've travelled the world to get to the United Kingdom come onto the beaches or off the back of the lorry, it's then up to them to hand themselves into the asylum process. A lot of them go to the police. Some of them actually turn up to the immigration centres. So we've got pot luck there on knowing who's coming in. So if you're going to talk about security and knowing who's in our country, then Safe Routes does that, because you know who's coming over. But you have to combine that with properly funding the National Crime Agency and the border agencies who can actually get on top of the crime gangs, and proper diplomacy with the French, not Boris Johnson diplomacy, who's irresponsible with his tweets and Macron calls and clown. So if you combine those things, then you actually start to create a more secure environment.
Ask him.
And then the other sort of element that I want to touch on is, once they've been through these awful procedures to get here, after probably a lot of suffering, they then can't work. So they're given £5.66 a day, often supporting families, etc., living in often squalid conditions that are outsourced for profit. Another disgusting point. And it's these conditions that are going to make people more likely to turn to crime, because that's how societies unfortunately work. Again, bad for national security, because you're forcing people to have to commit crime potentially to survive. So I think those points can be made to counter the Tory rhetoric and say, no, your hostile environment doesn't protect us. Creating this fortress where you treat people not like humans is bad for national security. Actually, a humane, more open policy is better for national security.
That's a point that people don't make, is it? It doesn't seem to be made often, but yeah, it makes perfect sense. Jane, have we got much coming in on the comments that you want to reference so far? Because we haven't spoken to you in a little while, because it's been so absolutely fascinating to hear from the panel.
Yeah, we've had quite a lot come in. So firstly, the solidarity for Moses in the chat there. Terrible that you've been through that and that your brother was put through that. No one should have to go through that. Neil Terry loves the fact that refugees do good where they settle, and think of all the people and how much they contribute to your lives and societies. Can you think of many who aren't valuable and it's ridiculous to think that people coming in couldn't be contribute to society. Eunice back said, brilliant, the type of arguments we need to counter the racist narrative. Cal Shaw has mentioned about she feels that the psychology is influenced by the media and politicians. She mentioned the way that the BBC have been portraying the situation in Ukraine. She feels very different to how they portrayed Iraq or Afghanistan, and that influences how the general public react to that. Mia said the terrorist label is thrown on anyone who is not white or who questions government policy. And she mentioned a quote from George Bush, "You're with us or you're with the terrorists." Really turned so many people against anyone who didn't just go along with the mainstream narrative. And I think that feeds very much into the way this government likes to do things. They don't like us to be talking, thinking, debating. They like a snappy punchline and don't think too much about it. Angel of Death says, unfortunately, we're living in reactionary times all over the world. Neil Terry mentioned a statue in Hull and the marina commemorating the 2.2 million refugees that landed in Hull and travelled to Liverpool and then on to the USA, and that they contributed a huge amount to America. And it's a history that's really thought of. He's put a link in the chat. And then I wondered if Mike might like to come back on this one, because it's uncomfortable, but I think it's something that needs tackling. Angel of Death did mention, I said, don't you fear that some of the Ukrainian refugees might be Nazis? And I think we've got to tackle these questions because it's what people are asking, isn't it? And if we don't answer them, people come to their own conclusions.
I think
Julie would be good on that as well, I believe. So yeah, Mike and then Julie.
Go on, Mike first, if you like.
Thank you. I think if you look at so what we're talking about here, forget Nazi. You're talking about an extremist who will harm people in order to carry out their political goals. So essentially what we've classed as a terrorist, right? That's what a Nazi is it not? So if that was to happen and someone did come over who has those viewpoints, then once it's discovered, etc., then they'll be deported in the same way with any person coming over as a refugee. But on the Nazi point, from what I've seen within Ukraine, is there is some elements in the right wing. Maybe Julie probably knows more about this. But like many nations around the world, there are right wing elements. We've got Nigel Farage, who's caused massive damage to the country. There's Le Pen in France. So obviously there's that very minimal risk, but like I said earlier, if known criminals come over, then like the rest of the EU, we'll get rid of them when they're discovered.
Maybe I'll answer that question. The refugees are mostly women, children, disabled people, elderly people. The men are not allowed to leave. Okay, if you're a man between the age of 18 and 60, the law in Ukraine changed so that all those men had to stay and fight. I think there's been some that there is a small group in Ukraine. I think they're called the Azov Brigade. They're small. They're a minority. I was in Ukraine in the days leading up to the invasion, and I was there the weekend of the Maidan anniversary, which is a memorial. A memorialization kind of event for the 100 people who died on the Maidan. And there's a kind of narrative about the Maidan that it was an American coup, it was an American-backed coup that was not a popular uprising, it was totally driven by a Nazi element. And I can tell you that 100 people died on the Maidan. They were all ages, they came from all professions, they came from lots of different places all across Ukraine. They included artists, students, teachers, railway workers, trade unionists, farmers, the whole caboodle. It was this broad kind of spectrum of Ukrainian society that wanted to join the EU. And this is important because like Ukraine is sitting there at this kind of crossroads, post-Soviet. Where do you go? Do you go back to Soviet times and have no democracy and a kind of dictatorial regime from the Kremlin? Or do you try and pursue a European future, which might be flawed, but at least would give you elements of democracy and would enable you to enjoy some of the benefits that accrue to EU members. And so there are people on the left who continue to promote this narrative about Nazis in Ukraine. And well, I stood against a Nazi here in the UK. I stood for election in 2014 against Nick Griffin. The Nazis here in the UK are in suits. Okay, they're not geared up in military uniforms. They took to wearing suits, and they became politicians, and they put themselves forward for election. And every country has a problem with its extremists, and Ukraine is no different. But I really think that we have to counter this this kind of narrative that is coming out about Ukraine, because one of the reasons, the main reason why I went on that trip with left progressive, socialist, Labour activists and elected members, trade union leaders, and a Ukrainian woman who's a professor of politics, we went on that mission to meet with and show solidarity to the Ukrainian left, because they feel totally abandoned by the left here in the UK and the US, frankly. And we met with incredible people who are fighting the same battles that we are fighting in the left. And when I hear this kind of denial of, the ability of Ukrainians to have a progressive left, it sounds to me, I get really concerned about people who wouldn't even allow that to happen. Can't imagine it, can't envisage it, because it would be like saying to us, well, you've got so many right-wing people in your country that you can't be a progressive left that fights against it. That's what we all have to do. So yes, there is an extremist group there, like there are in many places. But all the people who talk about this, look at the Wagner group. Okay, so the Wagner group are Putin's Nazi hitmen, and they're mercenaries, and they are cruel. They killed people in Syria. They've been in lots of African countries. They perpetrate all kinds of horrendous violence, sexual violence against women, and the most horrendous things. And they have been tasked by Putin with assassinating President Zelensky, Vitaly Klitschko, who I met when I was there, and a whole crowd of other people. And it would include some of the amazing Ukrainian MPs, many of whom are young and women, and they will all be on that hit list. Also, the journalists who are out there trying to keep the stories and the narratives and the truth coming through. So, sorry, I get quite emotional about this, because I've spent, the past 10 years visiting Ukraine, working with Ukrainians in that country, having gone there recently. And some of the people who talk about this sort of, right-wing extremist Nazi element have not been there. Okay, so this is, it's something that people like to use if they're anti-American and anti-imperialist. And, so the two things kind of go together. So people end up becoming kind of Putin apologists by default. And that is a terrible, dangerous place to be right now, because Putin is no socialist and no true communist either. He's a dictator. He's cruel. He was a KGB spy, and he's filthy rich, an oligarch himself. So we've got to think about who we're fighting here, right? Who we're fighting and what we're fighting for. And my belief is that we're fighting for the Ukrainians to have a left progressive socialist, European future, the same kind of future that we might want here in the UK.
I think it feeds into that very strange, childish binary that we have, isn't it? Where it's like there's good guys and bad guys, and like some people are saying, well, if you either side with Russia or you side with NATO, or it's a bizarre rhetoric at the moment. I believe it was 2.7% of Ukrainian people voted for a far right party at the last lot of elections.
Less than France.
Less than France, yeah,
and
I would hate to think that if something terrible happened where I live, that we would not be accepted in because there's a guy who dresses up as a Nazi who also turns up at war memorials about the Second World War, and trying to be more British than us whilst also supporting the Nazis. Like, if that was the rhetoric, if we couldn't be helped for that reason because of a small element of far right people, then it would be ridiculously unfair and bizarre. So yeah, thanks for answering that comprehensively. Let's get back to the refugee situation. That was absolutely massively important to address that, but let's get back to the refugee situation. So, Moses, earlier on you mentioned that you wanted people to recognise what a refugee is and what people are. How can we help to do that? So I think we're doing that tonight, and anyone who heard your story earlier on, if they failed to be moved by what you said earlier on, and I think it was difficult for us to hear, so I can't imagine how difficult it would have been to have lived that. I think that's an important thing, and being able for refugees to tell their own story. But how can we support people? How can we start to change this narrative and maybe even use the positivity towards refugees at the moment that from the Ukraine conflict to try to change the narrative for all refugees? Oh, you just muted again there, Moses.
What I believe is that, our governments, they only need to understand, because when the term refugee was first made, most governments were aware of it and they understood it. And now it's getting redefined again, because now the whole world now is like it is at run. People are just fleeing. You know what I mean? So if people are fleeing, now people need to understand, what do we need to do for these refugees? I remember the Ukrainians, I think the second day of the first bombardments, there was a protest in Newcastle, which I went there and I did stood in solidarity with the all Ukrainians. They gave me a chance to speak, and I really expressed my concern. And I so much wished that if the government can do something very quickly, simply because if you look at Putin is somebody who is like, again, is a gangster, not like, he is actually a gangster. A gangster is somebody who doesn't value any person, but they only value something that benefits themselves as individuals. That's Putin for you. So that's why he got no respect. He first went into Crimea. Yes, we know there are Russian-speaking people, but if there are Russian-speaking people but they are not in the Russian territory, they are in another territory, so they need to stand or to abide by the rules of that other territory. But you don't have to be a bully to go in and begin to fight for those people. You know what I mean? That's Putin. So the whole world was supposed to stand firmer rather than just advocating for these sanctions after sanctions after sanctions. The only people that suffer is us. You put sanctions. My country has been on sanctions forever, but the presidents, they are damn rich right now. They are the richest people. You know what I mean? They got blood money. They got so much of diamond, they're selling anytime they want. So who is suffering from those sanctions? It's not those people. They don't need anything. They got enough money, more than probably many people in this country. But we are suffering. We are saying, do not return us back to the mouth of the lions. But that's what actually is happening here. They take us, they round us up. They want to take us back to the people that say we are fleeing from. So now that's when we lose the meaning of the word, the term refugee, because we are being put back. You know what I mean? So we need to stand up. So what my concern is, we got Hassockfield, that detention for women. We've been going there. I think we went 3 months now. It's when we went there, there was only one lady. Imagine that whole building. It was containing only one woman. Then they later on, when we went the second month, they were now 18. And now today, I don't know how many are there, but we're advocating for it to be closed. Because here on the TVs, we see that the country wants to protect women. Women are always vulnerable. So I don't know, do we protect them by imprisoning them? Or are we protecting them by setting them free and give them whatever they need in order for them to sustain their life? So we want Hassockfield to be closed. We want all detention centers to be closed. We want people to be housed in a proper manner way, that they can actually get integrated into the community and begin to work for their lives and contribute to the economy of the country. That is the help that I really want to see happening. There are people that actually it's like by birth they just hate someone who comes from any other country. But we don't know, even this country was built mainly by people from abroad as well. I mean, I know my country is a colony, is a former colony of Britain. And we contributed so much from mineral, from farming, from everything. We contributed so much. But today, those people are saying, no, stay where you are. We don't want you here. So we have to ask, okay, we thought we've been working together in a nice way, in a productive way. But today now, simply because somebody is now trying to end my life, so can you protect me? That's what they are refusing. So we want to find a proper roadmap that will actually go inside this situation of refugee crisis, in order for us to uproot the elements that actually obstruct, because there is a lot of obstructions in that area. So we want to uproot those obstructions and actually give a safe haven for those people that actually looking to be integrated with inside this country.
I think the key word there's refuge, isn't it? And are we offering much of a refuge if you're detaining people who need that refuge? Mike, I'm sure you've got some opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, it just adds to the hostile environment, doesn't it? It's we're going to see some pretty messy times coming up, I think, in places like Dover, especially, that are impacted by this. And I think, we've put Labour have tabled amendments, and it's been pushed down. Even the Lords have amended, and it's been thrown back by the Commons. So it looks like Priti Patel's going to get her way with the Nationality and Borders Bill, and we are going to, unfortunately, become an even more hostile environment, which makes us less safe, unfortunately. And we have to treat other humans with dignity. It's as simple as that, isn't it? The right to work, decent accommodation, and on the accommodation, in Boris Johnson's own constituency, there's some outsourced refugee accommodation in one of the hotels there, who are turning over a massive profit. The name is Clear Springs is the name, and their profits have gone from 800,000 to 4.4 million in just over a year. Yet there's people trying to take their own lives in that accommodation because it's so bad. That's completely unacceptable, and that will only ever happen under a Conservative government. So, a massive step forward will be getting them out at the next general election.
What do we know? What Labour's policies are at the moment on this? Because I've seen recently a few things like, remember the controls on immigration mugs that we went down in 2014? That was actually the reason I joined the Labour Party, was this thing, that party's messed up. I need to get in there and start to try to argue from the inside against that kind of awful rhetoric. That was why I joined the Labour Party in 2014. Is that the direction of travel at the moment? Are we going back towards those things? Like, what do you think, Julie?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I'm still a member, but my energy at the minute is on working internationally on humanitarian and human rights issues, and working very, very locally with the No to Hassockfield campaign. So Moses, I think we were both there at the same time when we spoke. I think that Labour is still really bruised from the 2019 election, and followed swiftly by COVID, which nobody had a policy for, frankly. And I don't think that the party has really kind of sorted itself out in terms of, what it should be doing, because we've just been living in a kind of constant crisis following an absolutely bruising general election. And what I do think is that members have to pile on the pressure. Members have to really be saying to their Labour MPs and to the PLP and, to the leadership, have to be saying, we need to be the party that welcomes refugees. We need to be listening to Lord Alf Dubs, for example. There are some really good people in the party in important positions who are well respected, and we have to try and put those voices first and foremost. And I don't know, just put an enormous amount of pressure so that Labour can be brave what I think I see is a real lack of courage, actually. We need to be doing the right thing. I think I joined a party that I thought, I joined in 2010 when Labour lost the election, because when austerity was going to be the order of the day, everything that I knew was under threat. I worked in the arts, so the arts were going to be number one on the list of cuts. Libraries, career service, youth service, women's refuges, legal aid. I could just see career service, the whole thing. I was just like, everything I care about is going to be destroyed, so I have to join. Whilst I have a lot of friends in the Labour Party, and I managed to get myself elected, I'm not sure how that happened, but I did. And I actually think that the party machine is very timid, okay? And the party and the machine around the leadership and the machine and this kind of controlling kind of machine that wants to manage the message actually tends to drown out that kind of what we would say is authenticity. So lots of people said to me, you're great, you're really authentic. And I was thinking, well, what's that about? That was about me just talking about the things I really, really cared about, And I suppose I did that because I never thought I was going to win. So I had nothing to lose at the point where I was in the race. But I think there are mechanisms whereby we need to get to influential people in the party and ask some of those people, like Lord Alf Dubs and people who, who've done positive, good things about refugees, about immigration, to get those people to be listened to. We just have to get them, on our side and to be making much more of a case. But in the end, it ought to be the membership that makes the difference, the membership and the trade unions. And can I say, I had 2 trade union leaders with me in Ukraine. And I've recently also been to Iraq and again had 2 trade union leaders with me there. And the trade unions, I think, could be really instrumental in pushing the party to be much more progressive and forward thinking, and just demonstrate the compassion that so many of us feel, because that's one of the reasons why we're in the party. We want that equality and social justice, that right to life and human rights and basic services. We want that for everybody. So don't leave. I haven't left, right? If anybody's on there and they're thinking of leaving, don't leave, stay and fight and stand up for all these things, because these are the values that should be at the heart of the party. Yeah, but let's try and really bolster up the trade union messages. And I had both Mick Whelan, who was with me in Ukraine, and Chris Kitchen, who is the president of the National Union of Miners, say that they would come and speak at Hassockfield, which is great. That's absolutely fantastic. They have a position on this. And then when I was in Iraq, I was there with Mick McGowan from the Social Workers Union. And he also, they're all kind of offering to come and stand with us in solidarity at the gates of Hassockfield and speak up for a humane immigration and refugee system.
I think that the noises coming out of Labour show that the policy is going to be in the right direction. There's a lot of talk around lack of policy, which is always the case pre-election, really. When you're not in election period, you're less likely to get the opposition come up with a fully formed manifesto. But the noises that come out, the amendments to bills, and the sort of condemnation of conservative hostile environment shows that they're probably going in the right direction. I think that Barack Obama is someone that we can look to on this issue. And what he did was just really push the land of opportunity and unity over division, cynicism, and fear. And I think that's a really positive way of looking at it. And you can also potentially throw in there that national security is at stake with the current hostile system. So we'll see how it goes over the next year or two.
So we've all spoken about, like, there's obviously a political solution here, and in short term we actually really need political solutions. It's not going to wait till a general election, is it? And I'm thinking here now that our more southern guests here, so Jane and Mike, obviously Jane, you know a little bit about the situation in Dover, where you may have someone turning up for some photo opportunities and trying to take photos of desperate people arriving on dinghies, and as if they're some sort of really threatening thing. Now, I often think that people who are quite desperate in this country, seeing those people as a threat speaks volumes, because it shows how precarious their lives are if they don't even see themselves in the same area as some of the people in their local communities who are taking loads of money from the system, maybe like weapons manufacturers, which has been mentioned in the chat, or we've got billionaires that are causing so much damage to the country, and yet people are looking to these really desperate people and thinking, actually, you're the threat because you might replace me on the bottom rung of the ladder. How damaging is it when people are turning up? And I know you earlier on, Jane, you were talking about the Elfwicks and how they've been about immigration and so on. But I'm really interested to find out what's going on down there.
I mean, there's people think of the South as being a rich area, and I know I've said it before. There's huge wealth, but it is contrasted by abject poverty very close by. But I know, Mike's, you're quite involved in what's going on down here in Dover as well, aren't you? I know you've spoken about that quite a lot too. So I just think those people, a lot of the people, it's very easy to dismiss people as being a racist, but actually, when people are struggling to make ends meet, when if you're working in the gig economy, if you're working a 16-hour day and you can't even afford to keep the roof over your head, and your family's being torn to pieces by that situation, you haven't got a lot left in you to be understanding of other people's situations. It does awful things to you mentally. Poverty does terrible things to people, destroys the relationships they have, let alone having anything left. And then when I think, was it Jacqueline mentioned in the comments about, if you look at the front pages of some of the newspapers, what I too would view as racism and hatred on them, stoking these divisions. And when you've got these false messages coming out from government as well, because I heard Boris Johnson, or one of his ministers, saying the other day, just going on, we've had the most generous response to the Ukraine refugees, the most generous response, kept on saying it, and it's complete nonsense. But they say these sound bites, and people haven't got time to read about it and find out. But I'll stop talking now, because I quite like to hear what Mike's got to say about that.
I completely agree. The poverty enforced on our country by over a decade of Conservatives sets the environment for that sort of division, doesn't it? And unfortunately, it plays right into their hands, and they then stoke the fire. And it's only going to get worse with the new bills being passed, with an election looming, and Boris Johnson announcing that they're pretty much starting their campaign soon, probably after the locals, and that they will use division and cynicism, and we have to push back with exactly the opposite. And I genuinely believe that the people of this country are big-hearted and kind and tolerant, but if you set the conditions for it to be otherwise, then that will come out. And then if you stoke those flames, they will unfortunately get bigger. We just have to push back and essentially be the anti-Tories. That's it, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but all we can offer is hope, isn't it? They offer division, we offer hope. But the thing is, it needs to feel like what we're offering is in reach.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
I'm going
think
to
I think
ask.
the late. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, I was just going to ask. You know, you. This is very much what you've been talking about, Mike. We've been. Do we need to redefine security? Because I think there's a real potential to do that. We've seen energy security becoming a real thing, that people are now starting to understand the idea of having sustainable energy, not having to rely on other countries such as Russia for natural gas and so on. That's part of it. And food security, and and financial security, and all these things, actually, that should be part of the security mix, rather than just like the traditional national security, as in where like the army, the military, for example. Is that something that and anyone could come in on this, by the way, just, is that something we need to redefine, and is there an opportunity to do that?
I think so, and we're actually going to see a period of water scarcity. Well, I say a period, that's going to happen, and it won't get any better, unfortunately, which will have a massive impact on security. But yeah, I think the Labour Party need to push that the Conservatives are bad for security, whether that's security in keeping your job, keeping your house warm, putting bread on the table, being a victim of crime, or terrorism. It's the Conservatives that are bad for that, and Labour are otherwise. So yeah, I agree. All of those things can feed into that.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we've got 10 minutes to go, and I really want to hear from you on anything that we haven't managed to touch on tonight, because I may have not asked the right questions tonight. It's been so fascinating to hear all your stories, and we've gone off in different directions. But if there's anything any of you would like to say, I'm going to start off with Julie, and I'm going to finish with Moses, because I want Moses to have the final word here, as someone who actually lives as a refugee, understands that situation. It's so important to give refugees a voice. So what I'm going to say now is, I'm going to say, if you want to support Socialist Think Tank, you can become a member. It is free. You go to socialistthinktank.com. You can give us some donations if you want, which helps us with the running of the cost of what we do. But you do not get any special access. We do not have a tiered system. We are socialists. So if you give us nothing, you get the exact same access to us as you do for donating to us kindly. And you can also buy merch and things like that. There's all sorts of things that you can do, and make sure that you like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram and all those other places, and subscribe to us on YouTube as well. Really does help us. And subscribe to us on your podcasts as well. So I've got that over and done with. So now we're going to have the last maybe about 3 minutes each of just summing up. So I'm going to go to Julie, and then I'm going to go to Mike, and then I'm going to finish off with Moses, and then we'll end the show there. So Julie. Oh, you're muted.
I thought maybe I would finish off by talking about a report I wrote in the European Parliament, which was a response to the Charlie Hebdo murders and the Danish attacks. So this came from the Education and Culture Committee. So, when many terrorism attacks happen, there's a kind of knee-jerk response from governments, which is more surveillance, more guns, more police, more barbed wire, just like a kind of crackdown, and more suspicion, more fear. And what we did in the Education and Culture Committee was to stop looking at the end result of that, and start to look at the problems, the root cause. Why do people feel so excluded? Why do they feel so undervalued? And so my report proposed a whole load of activities and strategies to bring people together, to share each other's culture. So, and writing this report was not difficult for me, because I had spent my whole life in County Durham doing this kind of work, intercultural dialogue work, using arts and culture, music, people coming together to share food, different traditions. I'd been doing that for decades, and it works. okay, because it removes the fear and it demonstrates that fundamentally we all want the same things, and that actually when we share each other's culture, there's a great kind of joy and warmth that comes out of that. And then over the first winter of lockdown, I worked for City of Sanctuary, which is the UK's refugee welcome network, and its theory of change is really important because it's about encountering the other, and it really works. So when people who have come to this country are very vulnerable, and they've fled violence, they don't necessarily speak the language, they're in appalling conditions because the government don't have any money or whatever. But when volunteers from City of Sanctuary start to engage with those refugees and asylum seekers and share activities together and become friends, actually extraordinary things happen. And City of Sanctuary runs a whole load of programs around specific topics. So universities of Sanctuary, colleges of Sanctuary, businesses of Sanctuary, shops of Sanctuary, gardens of Sanctuary, theatres of Sanctuary, faith groups of Sanctuary. Whatever kind of sector you are in, you can be really public about the fact that you want to welcome refugees and asylum seekers. And the whole City of Sanctuary movement was a response to the hostile environment, which said, let's keep the strangers, the foreigners out. And people who set up the movement were going, actually, no, we need to find a way of demonstrating that fundamentally the British people are welcoming, and can understand and feel that sense of, and can feel empathy for people who find themselves, in the most appalling circumstances. So I'd just urge everybody, we've got a City of Sanctuary in Durham, and there's probably one in your town, and if there isn't, you can set it up, and please just check it out and get involved, because I think that is hope, and that's what we need to be speaking about.
Thank you so much. Mike?
Yeah, thank you. What I'll talk about is, quite briefly, around some of my experience with the National Crime Agency and where I think we're going wrong in tackling the crime gangs. Because obviously I'd like to see safe routes in, so that it takes a lot of that trade away, but they're still going to exist, and we do need to get that right. When I joined the National Crime Agency, 2012, I think it was at the end of SOCA, Serious Organised Crime Agency, which was more of an intelligence function. So they didn't have the enforcement wing, so they couldn't make arrests, etc. And I remember when they were rebadging, and I'd sort of been there for about 2 days, and I thought, this is great, this is exciting. They must be getting a lot more money then, because it's a new thing and they're taking it really seriously. And they'd actually cut the funding, yet rebadged. And now in 2022, the funding that the NCA receives is still not up to the levels that SOCA had. So it's clearly not being taken seriously. That said, the Home Office have thrown a lot of money at the border crisis from people coming over on boats. And what's been done with that money is they're spending it on gimmicks. So jet skis, radar equipment, drones. It's all Trump type gimmicks, not a wall, but similar type things that don't actually combat the problem. And this sort of problem is difficult to combat. So getting on top of these very organized, complex international crime gangs is difficult. And to take enforcement action and put them in prison isn't easy. Unfortunately, with our policing, we have a real emphasis on putting people in prison. But another way of dealing with it is disruption. And we've got good intelligence teams, but if we put more money into that and we can find out who's doing this, but not enough information to take them to court, we can actually start disrupting. And what that looks like could just be making an approach to these people and saying, we know what you're doing, and start disrupting the activity. And yes, you don't have the stats and it doesn't look good to the Home Office, but you do save lives. So the money can be better spent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. And Moses, what we're going to do is you can have the final word here, and then I'm just going to play the jingle and we're going to finish there. So please take it away. And thank you for sharing your own personal experiences as well. I'm sure people have been incredibly moved by what you've said tonight.
What I want to say to the refugees in the country or wherever they are, I want them to speak out. Their problems, what they are facing when they come into this country. They must express their experiences before they fled their countries, why they are here. Because what I see is like they are afraid, most of us, we are afraid to tell people who we are simply because of this I don't know the term, but it's advisable for whoever got any situation that they fail to solve themselves. There are good listeners out there. We got so many of citizens that are very capable of listening to your problem, and they can direct you to the proper bodies that can actually get in touch with you and they give you the help that you want. So I don't want them to be cocooned in their own world. They said, oh, because I am like this, I'm afraid. I am afraid. So because fear is the biggest enemy, because it downplays everything that you want to do in life. So I want all refugees to stand up just the same way we are doing. I want them to stand up and come forward and express their feelings, express themselves so that they can get help where possible.
Keep the red flag flying there.